Thank you for tuning into the RICO 12 speaker meeting podcast again. My name is Justin, and I'm a recovering addict. And thanks to my God, the steps and the fellowships of recovery, I am grateful to be sober since June 19th, 2015. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. Just this last Friday, on January 8th, David A. came in and spoke to us on primary and secondary addictions and God. And right at the very end of his talk and during the Q&A section, he answered a question that triggered a whole bunch of other questions that came in last minute in the chat, as well as from me. And I asked him if he would be willing to come back on Monday, which is today, and do an additional Q&A based on his talk from Friday. And I'm very grateful that he has agreed to do that. So here we have that. I'll just read this next bit here. RICO 12 is a self-supporting service, and we appreciate your help in keeping it that way. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the costs of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to rico12.com/support, or you can click the link in PayPal. That'll be in the live chat of the meeting, or it will also be in the show notes, and you can donate there. Please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 31. Okay. So if you have not yet listened to David's talk from Friday, I would highly recommend that at this point, if you're listening to this podcast, that you hit pause and go and check out that episode. Once again, it's entitled David A., Primary and Secondary Addictions and God, and it posted on January 8th of 2021. Then after you've listened to that, come back and listen to this additional Q&A so that you can get the background of what many of these questions are about. For those of you here live, you will notice that the setup is a little different. Typically, we do this in a webinar format where the audience is pretty restricted in ability to interact. Today, we chose to do a Zoom meeting where the live audience has more interaction with the speaker and the host. We are only recording the audio of this meeting, so any video will not be saved in any form. When we get to the Q&A part, if you have a question, you may either type it in the chat and I can read it, or you can choose to ask it live. Please raise your hand and I will call on you, and you can ask it vocally. Just know that your voice will be recorded and used on the podcast that will be released in the next 24 hours. If you have not yet listened to David's talk from last week, I would highly recommend that you hit stop on this episode and go back and listen to episode 30. All right, let's jump into this without any further ado. David, thanks again for coming back so quickly to do this. Before I start asking questions, can you please just take a few minutes and reintroduce yourself and a very brief overview of your topic from Friday, and then we'll start those questions.
Sure, totally. And if you don't mind, if I could just take a couple of moments to silently invite God in my own way, and you can as well. And if you're listening on the podcast, you can do that as well. So I'll actually just lead us in a prayer, and then we'll invite God in. God, please help me to set aside everything I think I know about myself, my disease, the steps, other people, the world, absolutely you, God, and maybe even my own recovery, so I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see the truth about all these things. And then just take a couple of moments to silently invite God in your own way. Amen. So, sorry, what was the question again?
All right. So just reintroduce yourself real quick and give a very brief overview of the topic and just maybe some points that you'd like to reintroduce from your talk from this last Friday.
Sure. Great. Thanks. Okay. So my name's David A. I'm a grateful, recovered alcoholic, drug addict. If you spend any time in AA or NA, you'll kind of realize it's not necessary to distinguish between drugs and alcohol, but I do, in case anybody who is listening does not know that. I'm also a recovered porn addict, which is a form of sex addiction. It's one of the ways that sex addiction manifests. I am a recovered caffeine addict. Most people are not caffeine addicts, but I definitely am. The jury is still out whether or not I am a food addict, but I am definitely gluttonous. And I can also go on the other side of that coin with anorexic and restrictive. And it's definitely something that I've had to turn over to God, to not eat for ease and comfort, and to surrender to a food plan, and to make some pretty big lifestyle changes. So just last week, I spoke about primary addictions, secondary addictions, and God. And basically it was sort of my story. And in that story, illustrating a lot of information of my recovery from first chemicals, drugs and alcohol, through the 12 steps as written by the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and establishing a personal relationship with God in that way. And then it sort of segued into how I was not really aware that I was either continuing with or beginning to engage in secondary addictions, specifically pornography, which I did not really know was problematic, but it progressed to the point where, through two-way prayer, God kind of called me out on it, and I had to go to another fellowship to address that. And in going to that other fellowship, I kind of started to learn the difference between recovering from, substances, and recovering from something that is a perversion of a biological drive, because there is no biological drive for drugs and alcohol, but there is a biological drive for food and for sex, right? And sort of understanding that makes the first step wildly different. And a lot of those fellowships have like circles or top lines and bottom lines and things like that kind of help you define abstinence for yourself. Because, if you're a sex addict, some sex addicts can have, multiple partners, and some can't. Some can have can masturbate, some can't. So we have to be able to define abstinence for ourselves. And yeah, that went into the talk of me addressing sort of secondary addictions. And then one of the questions was asking about attachment theory, and whether or not I thought that played a role in addiction. And in response to that, I started talking about adult children of alcoholics, and that sort of brought on this whole other cascade of questions.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I appreciate you giving that brief overview of things. We've had a couple of people join us live, and I'll jump in here and say this here for those joining live now. You'll notice that this meeting, if you've joined us before in the past, is a little bit different than how we typically run things. We got this set up in a Zoom meeting platform where the participants are able to see each other and actually ask questions, if they choose to, directly of the speaker. If you would like to ask a question, you can either type it in the chat here live, or you can raise your hand in there. There's options to raise your hand, and I can give you the floor, give you permission to unmute and ask that question. If you do choose to do that, your voice will be recorded, and it will be in this podcast format. Anyways, thank you very much for joining us. And now we'll just start with a couple questions. David, you mentioned, like you said at the end, the adult children of alcoholics, and you mentioned the concept of physical allergy to intimacy. Now, I'm very familiar with allergy when it comes to addiction. I'm very familiar with the concept of physical allergy to addiction, whether it be alcohol or drugs or lust or whatever it is that caffeine, like you mentioned earlier, whatever it is that allergy is to. I have not yet heard somebody say, having a physical allergy to intimacy, which is different than lust, which is different, in my opinion, in my experience, than sex. Can you please expound on that just a little bit, David?
Sure. So when we talk about the physical allergy, it's originally coming from the big book, right? And, in the doctor's opinion, they talk about it a lot, right? And they talk about the phenomenon of craving and wanting more. One of the definitions that I learned for the physical allergy, which is actually through a step working guide called Big Book Awakening, is an abnormal reaction to a substance or a condition of unusual sensitivity to a substance, which in like amounts does not affect others, right? So other people can do this behavior or this substance and it affects me differently, right? Like I react to it differently. I have an abnormal reaction. So with intimacy, the abnormal reaction for me isn't more, more, more. It's not the phenomenon of craving. It's the opposite, right? It's like no, like go away. I get repelled from that, and it manifests for different people in different ways. Like I've heard people identify with this and be like, yeah, after I reach a certain intimacy with a partner, I just start picking them apart. I start noticing all these imperfections I didn't notice before. I mean, things like that, just like how the mental obsession is any idea that gets me to drink or drug or lust or act out sexually, right? And it can be any idea as long as the bottom line is, relapse, go back to the compulsion, right? So the physical allergy to intimacy, like in my experience, can be really sort of any train of thought where the bottom line is, I'm pushing you away, I'm withdrawing. And just to be like as stringently honest as possible, I did not read physical allergy to intimacy in ACOA literature, not in the red book that they use or the yellow step working guide. I was also going on YouTube and listening to a lot of ACOA talks. And one of the interesting things about ACOA is you can actually co-sponsor each other. Like it can be a group of people that have never been through the steps, going through the steps together. And you can even find therapists that are approved in ACOA that can sponsor you. You can have a therapist sponsor you if they understand adult children of alcoholics. And I was listening to a YouTube chat of a therapist. I forget his name. This guy, he was in his 60s. He had a white beard, white hair. He was from the Midwest, who was a therapist who was trained in adult children of alcoholics. And he was talking about this physical allergy to intimacy. And it really rang true for me. So, yeah.
I really appreciate that. Thank you, David, for that. Another question that came up for me, and once again, you can type in questions if you're in the live audience or raise your hand and I'll give you the floor happily. But another question that came up for me, you talked about the circles, and I'm somewhat familiar with the circles of recovery, but it's not the way that I came up through the steps. Can you please expound on that for me a little bit so I better understand that and see how that fits in with everything?
Sure. So I learned about the circles in Porn Addicts Anonymous. It's an exercise that they took from Sex Addicts Anonymous, from the Green Book of Sex Addicts Anonymous. And basically, you on a piece of paper, you draw 3 circles. So it'll kind of look like a bullseye. There's a circle in the center, which would be like the bullseye. There's a circle around it. That's the middle circle. And then there's a circle around that. That's the outer circle. And the bullseye is called the inner circle. And in the inner circle, I would put what is a relapse for me. So for me, in terms of sex addiction, a relapse is viewing pornography in any form at all. That's the only thing that constitutes a relapse for me in terms of my sex addiction. Masturbation for me is not a relapse. In my middle circle, those are the gray area things that can kind of be of a slippery slope to a relapse. So for example, in my middle circle, there is mindlessly scrolling on social media. You know what I mean? If I am mindlessly scrolling on Facebook or YouTube, it's only a matter of time before I might see an image, a woman in a tight dress, something like that. And I'll have a physical allergy to that. Just like, maybe an alcoholic isn't primarily a pothead, but, if they smoke a joint, they might develop a craving for more marijuana, which eventually will lead them back to alcohol, right? So it's the same thing for me with those sort of explicit images. The interesting thing is I can be watching TV and an image like that can come up and I can avert my eyes. And as long as I avert my eyes, it doesn't turn into the physical allergy for me. But if I'm mindlessly scrolling on social media, it's sort of like me hanging out in a bar when I have no reason to do so. So that's the middle circle. And there are other things in my middle circle too, like fantasy. I really have not found a healthy way to have fantasy at all. It seems that when I start fantasizing about something that could be healthy for me, it quickly turns into an unhealthy fantasy. And then there's the outer circle, which are all the things that are healthy for me. So obviously step work is in my outer circle, but also exercise, being in nature, art, things like that. And the thing that I found really valuable about these circles is you get to define abstinence for yourself. So I have sponsees who have more in their inner circle than just pornography. So yeah. And then also I found that applying that concept to things like food, you know what I mean? Like I know I have middle circle behaviors around food, like hanging out downstairs watching TV too late. That refrigerator starts to call to me. For some reason, if I'm in bed watching TV, the refrigerator doesn't call to me after a certain time at night. And it was hard for me to synthesize these things with the big book because I was like, what about avoiding temptation? But then when you read it, in later chapters of the big book, we can be anywhere. We're free men as long as we're not trying to get a vicarious feeling of pleasure. It's basically all those middle circle things for me are like me hanging out in a bar when I have no legitimate business.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate the clarifications on that. Another question that I had from this last meeting that you mentioned, and this may take a minute to try and go back to that, but I think the concept is something that's universal, but how it connects to what we discussed in the meeting, it may take a second for you to recall that. But it's the third step promises. You talked about the third step promises, and I love the third step promises. I love the third step. But can you expound on the importance of the third step promises in primary and secondary addictions and in God?
Sure. So yeah, the third step promises, we had a new, these are some of this pair, I don't have it exactly, but we had a new employer being all powerful. He provided what we needed as long as we kept close to him and performed his works well. We became less than interested in ourselves, our little plans, designs, and desires. More and more we became interested in what we could contribute to life as we felt new power flow in, as we enjoyed peace of mind, as we found we could face life successfully. We were reborn. It's pretty close, but paraphrased. I know I missed some things. So like for me, the third step promises happened in two ways. If you listen to the last podcast, there was one, this gift, this white light initial spiritual experience where I got those promises for a little while without continuing with the step work. And then it went away because I didn't continue with the step work. And then I did the step work and I got those promises back. So, I think it's important to clarify when I'm working with sponsees, like I don't need to have those promises in my life in order to complete the third step, right? In order to complete the third step, I need to, say the third step prayer and express the sentiment, sincerely that I am making a commitment. I am signing a contract with God to work the rest of the steps. And in exchange for working the rest of the steps, God will give me a spiritual awakening. And part of that will give me the personality change that will manifest those third step promises. So like, for me in addressing my primary addiction, it was really like that when it came down to step work. Am I willing to make this commitment, to sign this contract and move forward with the work? And then doing the work gave me those promises in my life. With the secondary addictions, the third step became more operational in terms of surrender, in terms of setting aside everything I thought I knew about recovery, because I was addressing these secondary addictions with like over 7 years of like really solid recovery from chemicals and spiritually fit. It wasn't like I had unmade amends. It wasn't like I was living in 10, 11, and 12. It wasn't like I was emotionally unstable. Like by all accounts and all my relationships, David's a stand-up guy, but I had these crutches, you know what I mean? And, when I started getting told about these circles and, that the obsession would lift, but it would be different, there might still be situations where something could, okay, so for example, with my recovery from substances, right? I have the 10-step promises and there's actually a legal marijuana farm close by where I live. And during the summer, I can roll down the windows and I can take a big breath of air and I can smell that marijuana and say, that smells good, and have all these memories about it. And it does not turn on my mental obsession. You know what I mean? Not at all. I can watch movies with drugs in them and watch people melting down drugs and spoons, and it does not turn on my mental obsession, But with sex stuff, if I were to see something and I were to do the equivalent of rolling down the windows and taking a big breath to enjoy that smell or that sight, that is going to turn on my mental obsession, you know? So I had to surrender everything I thought I knew about what it means to be recovered. You know what I mean? To work these other programs and really kind of surrender to the first steps in those programs. And that surrender was messy. Like I had to go through a period of detox from pornography, from caffeine, you know, an emotional detox from eating to satisfy ease and comfort and emotional needs. And that was difficult to be like, wow, here I am. I've made all my amends. I live in 10, 11, and 12. I live a life of surface and I am extremely restless, irritable, and discontent, you know, and it is because of a physiological thing that's going on with me, and it will pass. And I might have to do some middle of the road recovery right now. You know, I might need a meeting while I'm going through this detox. I might need to fellowship while I'm going through this detox. And that's not how I was brought up in AA. You know, if I need a meeting, then my spiritual condition is messed up. But I was going through like a physiological detox and post-acute withdrawal symptoms with these other compulsions. And, you know, now my recovery from porn slash sex, whatever you want to call it, from, you know, caffeine, from food stuff, you know, jury's still out if I'm really a food addict or not, but whatever. It is more like my recovery from substances in that, like, I don't need these external things, but I certainly needed them in the beginning. I definitely had to white knuckle it through like a little bit of that time. And that required me to set aside everything I thought I knew about recovery. So like it was a much deeper surrender, you know?
I really appreciate that, David. I think that that's something that's been really hard for me personally to wrap my head around. In that, you know, in my primary addiction, which is lust, sex, and lust, I have no, I cannot roll down the window and take a deep breath. I think it's, for me, it's not that way. But the obsession has been cured. I'm not obsessing with those things anymore. But in secondary addictions, and one that you know you and I you've discussed here a little bit, as whether the jury's out or not for you, but I'm a food addict. It's what it is. But I have a really hard time letting go what I've learned about recovery in the past, and trying to basically start over from square one. And I appreciate your insights as to how you are working that and have done that and continue to do that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I can't roll down the windows and take a deep breath with sex stuff either. What's changed is that the obsession has really lifted, and it was the moment that I actually fully accepted that the obsession might never really lift, that it did. So I think it was like God doing an Abraham and Isaac thing with me. But anyways, yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and that's a great clarification. All right. We've had several more people join live, so I just want to do another quick, hey, if you have questions that you'd like to ask David, you can raise your hand or type it in the chat. If you raise your hand, I'll give you the floor to ask verbally. Your voice will be recorded for the podcast, but we're grateful to have you all here. And we're just asking questions of David about this last speaker meeting that he was a speaker in the RICO 12 speaker meeting. You mentioned going through the steps using the Back to Basics program, and you talked about Wally P's Back to Basics. Do you mind expounding on that just a little bit? And I've read Wally P's book, How to Talk to God, and I love it. But that's all I've got from him. Tell me a little bit more about the Back to Basics.
Sure. So back to basics. So when AA first started, it had a 75% recovery rate. That means that 75% of the people who went to an AA meeting back in the 1930s never drank again. You know, actually, what really, half of them never drank again, and then that last 25% went out and had a slip, and then came back and never drank again. But still, if you compare that to what AA is like today, it's not the same. And if you compare other 12-step fellowships to what it's like today, it's not the same. The recovery rates are lower. It's not 75%, you know? So this historian, this AA historian and archivist, Wally P., started doing all this research. What was different in the 1930s and 40s? How were they working the steps? Was it different than it is today? And he found that it was very different. He found that people were working the steps very quickly, sometimes in as little as one day, sometimes in a 3 to 5 day stay at St. Thomas Hospital where Dr. Bob worked. Basically it was based on the Oxford Group program. So if you know about AA history, Bill Wilson was an Oxford Group member. Dr. Bob was an Oxford Group member. AA number 3, Bill Dodson, was an Oxford Group member. Clarence Snyder, the guy who really started AA in Cleveland, Oxford Group member. The big book wasn't written yet. And the Oxford Group was a first century Christian movement that was started by a guy named Frank Buckman, who he wasn't an alcoholic. He was a priest or a pastor or something, and he ran a boys' home in New Jersey. And he got into a dispute with some of the board members over the budget, and he caught a resentment, and he quit that job, and he started backpacking across Europe to try to get closer to God. And he wasn't feeling closer to God until he listened to some nuns talk about forgiveness. And she was talking about how until we really forgive, we're cut off from God. And he realized that his resentment towards these people back, across the Atlantic was what was cutting him off from God. So he wrote them a letter of amends. And when he admitted his wrongs, and his pride to them and expressed his remorse, his resentment lifted. And then he felt closer to God. And he got this, he's not the first person to get this idea, but, he got this idea that, there's almost this version of the Trinity between me, another person, and God, right? And the big book tells us God is inside all of us. We found the great reality deep down within. So when I harm you, when I put a disconnection between me and you, I put a disconnection between me and God. And that's why the 9th step is so powerful, right? So he came back to the States and decided to bring this to his church communities. He felt that there was a lot of religion and dogma going on, but not a lot of actually living like the first century Christians, living like the Sermon on the Mount. And if you know AA history, you know that Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, they were reading the Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox. You know what I mean? This was a big part of their early literature and study. They were studying this before the big book. The big book wasn't written yet, they found that in this program, the Oxford Group program, which involved surrender, sharing, restitution, and guidance. So surrender was surrendering to God, which we do in the 12 steps. And step 1, we surrender to the disease. And 2, we become willing to believe that God can restore us to sanity. And in 3, we surrender. In the Oxford Group, there was sharing, right, which turned into AA's steps 4 through 7. I write my inventory, I share it with another person in the 5th step, and then I share my defects with God in 6 and 7, right? Restitution became AA steps 8 and 9, and service became steps 10, 11, and 12, right? 10 is a daily inventory, 11 is prayer and meditation, and 12 is, service and carrying the message and practicing the principles. But the truth is, I really can't be of service if I'm not practicing 10 and 11, right? So that was the Oxford Group program. And they went through it quickly. And if you look at page 13 in Bill's story, you can see that Ebby took him through that in like one afternoon while he was still detoxing in Towns Hospital in New York City, under the care of Dr. Silkworth. So Wally P. interviewed family members of original AAs. He looked at, magazines and newspaper articles that sort of gave statistics on early AA. He looked at grapevine articles around the time, and he compiled how these early beginners meetings were run. So back then, beginners meetings was not like a share from a speaker and then shares from the floor. It was a crash course in all 12 steps. And they did this surrender, sharing, restitution, and guidance usually over the course of 4 weeks as a group, because AA was growing so fast that there were so many newcomers that there weren't enough, quote unquote, old timers for each individual old timer to sponsor an individual newcomer. One person could take a group of people through these steps. And then, in 4 weeks, you could have a spiritual awakening, the obsession could be removed, and you could become a sharing partner, which is basically a sponsor for Back to Basics. And that's how part of how AA grew so quickly. And you can actually read about that in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And also you can find some of that in the forwards and the prefaces of the big book about that adolescent period. Well, actually, no, it was before the adolescent period, but it's in the prefaces and the forwards when AA was really growing at those exponential rates. So yeah, that's Back to Basics. And I was taken through Back to Basics before the big book, right? So that's usually how I work with sponsees and how I know a lot of people use Back to Basics now. Even though I know plenty of people that have made all of their amends through a Back to Basics style recovery, and they're just as spiritually fit as I am. It's not like, oh, I'm more spiritually fit because I did the big book. But the big book has given me the tools of 4-column inventories, which I found really helpful. But that's one of the biggest differences between Back to Basics and the big book is it's a simplified inventory. It's just, these are the ways I'm selfish. These are the ways I'm dishonest. These are the ways I'm afraid. This is how it has caused harm in my relationships. And of course, that turns into the amends process. Also, Back to Basics talks a lot about two-way prayer and the 11th step. There's also another great website, which Justin will probably give you a resource to for two-way prayer. And it's basically I write down a question for God, and I listen for the calm, still voice, and I write down what the calm, still voice tells me, and I record it on paper. And then I use the test for self-will versus God's will. And that's another thing that came from the Oxford group, which is also in Back to Basics. In the big book, we read all about selfishness, self-seeking, dishonesty, and fear. In the 10th step, we're told to look for, resentment, selfishness, dishonesty, and fear, right? So those things are all synonymous with self-will. In the Oxford group, they had the 4 absolutes. They strove for absolute unselfishness, absolute honesty, absolute purity, and absolute love, which is the opposite of selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, self-seeking, and fear, right? So then we apply that test for self-will versus God's will, or the 4 absolutes, to the written guidance. And that's an Oxford group practice. And that's also in Wally P's Back to Basics. So like I said, I usually use it as a crash course with all 12 steps with sponsees. And then we go through the big book line by line. So I explain it like if you were in a car crash, the EMTs would work on you on the street and in the ambulance long enough to get you to the hospital to do the big procedure. So it's triage, right? That's how I use Back to Basics a lot of time. Is it's the EMTs, it's the triage, and then once somebody has had a spiritual awakening, once the obsession has been removed, once they're spiritually fit, emotionally stable, sometimes in as little as a day, it takes no longer than a period of weeks. Then you go through the big book line by line. And, I've heard people say, and I think there's truth to it, that a lot of the reason why people go out on the 4th step is because it's so big and it's such an undertaking. And, it takes so much time. And if you're sitting there as an untreated addict, alcoholic, whatever, dealing with all that unmanageability, the restlessness, the irritability, the discontentedness, you haven't made contact with God yet, you haven't gotten the relief yet, and you're facing these things, it might be harder for you to get through that. Now, I also know a ton of people who did that Back to Basics, or did that, big book 4-column inventory without ever doing Back to Basics, and they made it through. You know what I mean? And their sobriety is amazing also. You know what I mean? So, I do think Back to Basics is a really effective tool. It's definitely part of my experience. It's how I got my spiritual awakening, and then I went through the big book line by line and got more tools. But yeah, I could keep talking, but I think that's probably good enough for, a Back to Basics explanation.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And that was it's made me think, how can I be of better service to those that I sponsor? And I think that's something that I can consider implementing in my own walk with those that I sponsor. Thank you for sharing that. Once again, if you in the live audience here have a question for David, You can either raise your hand there in the participants list and I'll call on you, or you can type the question in the chat and I'd be happy to read that for you. David, is there anything else that is kind of weighing on your mind right now that you would like to share about your experience, strength, and hope in recovery and in this topic?
Well, I guess like what I'll say a little is I feel strange not talking about God more. So like if you're somebody who's already in the solution, you could probably understand how like all these things I'm saying, like, help lead us to God, and I'm talking about all these different like first step issues and surrendering to them and, different ways of going through the steps. But, I guess I'll just say, and I guess it could sound very complicated, right? All these things aren't something that I set out to do the first day I decided I wanted to get sober. Like God guided me to all of these things. You know what I mean? And it's really my personal relationship with God that's more important than anything else. So it's like, for example, all this food stuff, right? I got all these ideas by doing two-way prayer, by God guiding me, this is the food plan you need to create, this is what your trigger foods are, you know what I mean? I was guided to adult children of alcoholics through the amends process in AA. You know what I mean? I was making amends to people who started telling me some things about my own personal experiences growing up and sort of recommended that I seek some help around some things. And, that was God working through others, and guiding me, to go check out, adult children of alcoholics. So I'm not going to try any harder than I already have to kind of mention God, because I know when I'm trying, it's sort of self-will, but I know in everything I've already said, there's so much God in it, so much God behind the scenes and working through it. But it's sort of like, I just kind of want to put that in the credits, so to speak.
No, actually, I'm going to dig a little bit there because, David, I know your, at least your conception, your experience with God and a God growing up and now is different than mine was growing up. I was in a very, very staunch religious home. I was turned off subconsciously to God. I'd still say, oh, God, this, God, that, God, everything, but not believe it because God didn't answer my prayers. He didn't take away the obsession when I asked him because I wasn't willing to listen. The God of my understanding or misunderstanding at that point was not powerful enough to do that. And you mentioned Friday in your talk that you had an aversion, like a repulsion from religion, from prayer, from that. Tell me how you have come from that. And I'm not saying that you've moved into religion because that's not it. And I don't think that's the solution for a lot of people. But tell me how that journey has looked from into the God of your current understanding, if that's what you would like to call it.
Sure. So it's definitely more the God of my experience, but so yeah, like I grew up in a secular Jewish family, which pretty much means that our religion was psychology. Both my parents were therapists, and but I remember when I was a little kid, my dad was walking with me in the backyard, and he asked me, "What do you think God is?" And I said, "I think God is, different for every person, and like what they believe is true for them." And he was like, "Yeah, I think so too." So, this sort of spiritual idea of like a higher power or like a positive energy wasn't discouraged, but it also wasn't strongly encouraged. But we definitely had prejudices. We had prejudices against organized religion. We had prejudices against Christianity, and I could explain what those prejudices were, but I don't want to get too negative. But we weren't open to it. Um, uh, I see a question just popped up there. So, but let me just finish answering your question. So yeah, and then when I started getting in trouble with drugs and alcohol around 13, and that it continued until I got sober at 29. I would go in and out of rehabs and in and out of meetings and whatever, and I would hear people talking about God, and I would view it with the same prejudice. You know what I mean? Um, but like because of the way I was raised, I was very open to meditation. I was very open to anything Eastern. I was very open to anything that like had a hippie vibe. You know what I mean? Um, so I didn't have prejudice against those things. And then when I when I took my second step and I didn't know it was when a corrections officer said to me, are you scared yet? And I said, yeah. And he said, I don't know if you believe in anything, but you better start praying. And, I'd heard that before in meetings, like the obsession wasn't removed until I got on my knees and asked the God of my understanding. And, I was like, how dare you? You know what I mean? But I had gotten the gift of desperation, alcohol had beat me into a state of reasonableness. And I was willing to pray, you know? And long story short, because I see there's a question there. It was in starting to work the steps that I started to have experiences that proved to me that God, like here, I'll tell you one experience, one of the many experiences that proves to me that God exists, right? My family didn't really want to accept my amends because I had hurt them so horribly and for so long. And I was okay with that. I followed the instructions. I made the attempt and then I left them alone. And then I was graduating from a rehab, because I was there for 16 months. I did my steps while I was in rehab, yada, yada, yada. And somebody took a picture of me with a friend of mine out in front of the rehab, like waving goodbye. And I went to save it on my cell phone and I accidentally posted it to Facebook. I never post anything on Facebook. I certainly wouldn't post a picture of me in front of a rehab on Facebook. And I know how to use smartphones and technology. It just was a glitch and it just happened. And then the next thing you know, there's a picture of me in front of this rehab on Facebook. And then the next thing you know, all these people that I helped and sponsored and whatever were like, way to go. And you helped me so much and this and that and da, 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 da. And like the 30th comment was my cousin who was like, wow, I guess this thing is for real, you know? And I was able to make amends to him, which then I was able to make amends to my uncle, which then sort of got my mom to warm up to the idea, which kind of got my dad to warm up to the idea, which kind of got my brother to warm up to the idea. And like, that wasn't me, like that was God doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. So, and I have a million stories like that where by submitting to the 12 steps, I had experiences that proved to me beyond the shadow of a doubt that I know, God exists. And, in my conception of that, I really don't have one. I don't really know what it is. It's something along the lines of energy, but it really doesn't matter. That's one thing I've really found is I don't think God cares what we call him nearly as much as we put, emphasis on it. I think God cares about, how we live. And I call God he, but I don't think it's a he at all. I definitely think there's feminine and masculine energy in it. And, probably more than just feminine and masculine, but that's enough because I see we have a question.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, David. Yeah, we have a question came in from Wendy. And she mentions the home group that you mentioned being a part of on Friday. She says, in 103, we do not distinguish between addictions because we focus on the solution, which is God. If I am living in the solution and experiencing the promises, I didn't think it was possible to develop another addiction. What could be a warning sign that I am developing or may develop a secondary addiction?
So, I mean, I really don't know how to tell someone to identify it in themselves. Um, uh, I know for me, right? So, my caffeine addiction started very early, right? But I'll say, so I'll start from when I got sober. So I got sober, I was forced to detox, and I was a heroin addict. So I was very used to that cycle of, I'm sick, I'm going through withdrawals, I need to shoot up to get well, or snort to get well. Um, and that was gone, right? And I didn't like the idea of not being physically dependent on something. And I remember my first sip of coffee when I was, physically sober. And I remember making a contract in my mind, like, I will be addicted to this now and it will be okay. You know what I mean? And I mean, it really was, you know what I mean? Like, nobody got hurt, but, I couldn't stop. I had a physical allergy to caffeine. There's not enough caffeine for me. I have a cup of coffee and I want another one and I want another one and I want another one and I want to see if I can put ginseng in it and I want to see if I can mix it with tea and I want to see if I can mix it with other legal herbal stimulants, and then I want an energy drink, you know what I mean? And then when that's too much, I want to take, chamomile and lavender and, all sorts of legal non-narcotic, like, downers, and I want to create like a sobriety speedball, you know what I mean? So like and then when I tried to stop, I had the mental obsession. I was walking around AA for 2 years, and every time I went to a meeting, I was like, well, it's coffee brewed at the meeting. Everybody else is able to drink it, responsibly and safely. And, and not only that, I also have the abnormal reaction to it. I'm sensitive to caffeine. It makes me very neurotic and anxious. My dad isn't like that. My dad can drink like 4 cappuccinos and take a nap. That's not me. Um, so yeah, I had the allergy and the obsession for caffeine. I had the allergy and the obsession for pornography. I would try to abstain and I couldn't. You know what I mean? And I was compulsive about it. I'd be watching pornography for no sexual reason whatsoever. Or I'd be using it when I didn't want to or didn't feel particularly sexual in some way. It was the disease didn't care. The disease was, we're going to watch this more and more. It was progressive. Um, and I can say that, like, maybe if I would have taken some of the suggestions I heard in 103, it might not have happened. I remember when I did the checkoff list in Back to Basics, it talked about purity. It talked about sexual purity. It talked about pornography as something impure. And I was like, that's just ridiculous. You know what I mean? Like, I grew up in a sex positive home. Um, so maybe if I would have internalized those four absolutes more, I wouldn't have gone there. But I still think the propensity would have been there in me. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that was really my barometer for it. Was I had a full blown allergy and obsession, and I had taken these things deep into steps 6 and 7, and created rituals around, surrendering, yoga rituals and meditation rituals. And I would be able to abstain. I abstained from caffeine for 2 years, but the obsession didn't go away. And I could abstain from pornography for months at a time, but eventually the obsession would come back and win out. And that hasn't been my experience with other character defects. As long as I stay spiritually fit, like, I don't have an obsession for selfishness. You know what I mean? Like, it's my personality has changed. So that was the barometer for me.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that, David. We had another question come in. This is from Nuno. Can you share some of your highlights of your experiences with spirit? I find people are often cautious about individual experiences with spirit and don't understand why that is. Thank you.
Oh, here we go. Okay. So, wow. I had some incredible experiences with spirit. So wow. So it actually started before I got sober, right? Like, when I I took a yoga teacher training, and they talked about the chakras, and they made them sound very mystical and magical. And for, a couple of $1,000 more, we'll teach you all about them. Right. So I didn't bite. But then when I was really at my rock bottom, getting towards my rock bottom, I decided to look up chakra chanting online, you know, and I started chakra chanting in my little apartment, even though I was still actively using and doing all sorts of other horrible things too. And it was really like I wasn't ready to change yet, but I was ready to start doing some sort of spiritual activity that I felt on some level would either change me or create a set of circumstances that would make it easier for me to change. And so I was doing this chakra chanting like for 30 minutes a day for like weeks on end, And then I had a dream, and in the dream I was in the Bronx because that's where I would go to buy heroin. And I went in the dream. I went down an alleyway and walked into a bunk from the summer camp I was in, and the door flew open, and in there was a terrarium with these like slugs that I knew had psilocybin, magic mushrooms in them. And I eat them, and I start tripping in the dream, and I end up in a bathroom stall, and the whole world is spinning, and the door flies open, and Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm is standing there, and he says, "What are you doing here, kid? It's time to move along. It's time to move it along." And then I was underneath a giant yellow building that I couldn't get out from under, and I woke up and I knew I was going to jail. And I got arrested a little while later. That's when God rescued me, and I ended up on Rikers Island in C95, which is a giant yellow building. And I couldn't post bail or bond out, not because it wasn't awarded to me, because I didn't have the money and nobody in my life had the money or was stable enough to have an address or whatever. And when you're in jail and you can't get out, sometimes they say they put you under the building. So there I was underneath a giant yellow building that I couldn't get out from under. You know what I mean? And then after I had my white light spiritual experience in jail, which is another experience I had with spirit, this guy had a cigarette in there and he wanted me to hold it, which is contraband. And this small, still voice inside of me said, "Don't hold that cigarette." And I didn't listen. And I put it in my pocket. And sure enough, like 10 minutes later, they came in to search the whole dorm, and they had video cameras there. So it was going to be recorded, and I would have gotten a charge. And I just prayed, I was like, "God, if you get," and this wasn't a foxhole prayer. This was different, even though it sounds like one. I was like, "God, I will never betray my conscience again. If you deliver me." And they didn't find the cigarette in my pocket, and it was a miracle. And then when I was getting out of rehab, I remember they told me, "You can stay here as long as you want." And then a week later, they were like, "You got to go." And I was going to have to go to a 3-quarter house, and I was scared. And I was going to every drug counselor in the building to be like, "We got to work something out." And every door was closed. And so I sat there and I meditated, pause when agitated or doubtful. And I got guidance, and I could feel this volcano in my belly well up. And it wasn't me talking. It was a voice greater than me talking. And it said, "I am powerful beyond measure." And I knew I had nothing to fear, and I was able to, go to the 3-quarter house and, live there and, go through that process. And I remember one morning I was meditating before I went to go make amends. This was several years later. I was going to go make amends to some people in Connecticut. But first I was going to run some errands around town. And in meditation, God told me, F your errands. You need to get up to Connecticut right now. And you need to go to this gas station in Reading, Connecticut, because there's a guy there that you owe an amends. And that's the last place he worked. So I drove up to this gas station and I asked for this guy, and they were like, "We don't want any part in this, but you might be able to find him over at the supermarket." And I go to this supermarket and I ask around. They're like, "We don't want any part in this, but you might be able to find him somewhere else." And then this guy comes out of the supermarket and he's like, "I used to be in a 12-step fellowship, and I know what you're doing, and I want to help you." And he gives me the number of this guy I used to do a lot of crime with. And I called this guy up, and he's like, "Yeah, I know where so-and-so is." And I get this guy's phone number, and I'm able to make amends to him. And then there's somebody else I have to make amends to. And I'm on the phone with the guy that I'm making amends to. And he's like, "I know where that guy lives, but I can't tell you. Like, if I was there, I could direct you." And I end up putting it on FaceTime and put the phone up in the windshield. And this guy's like, "Take a left, take a right, take a left, take a right." And he drives me to this dude's house. And I, you know what I mean? It was all guided by God. And I mean, there's so many more. I mean, I remember I was working as a yoga teacher before I was able to make amends to my family. And the woman there was like, you know, I'm going to give you free energy healing. I want to help you in your recovery. So we ended up doing something called family constellation healing. And we invited my mom and my dad into the room. And I had spoken to them for 5 or 6 years by now. That's an exaggeration, for around 5 years, except for my mom for some very small interaction, but my dad, a solid 5. Um, and my dad was a marathon runner, and he used to have these gym shoes in the garage and they stunk like sweat. And we invited him into the room and I could smell his sweat. You know what I mean? And we invited my mom into the room and I could smell like her perfume. Um, and I could feel the horror my dad grew up in, you know? Um, and talked to me and she said, I love you, you know? And then we ended the session and it was like literally thunderclapped and rain just started pouring down. And it was like such a huge relief. And I found out later on that around the same time, my mom went to a psychic to ask about my brother. And at the end of the session, the psychic said, oh, your oldest son, his name starts with a D. He was involved in some really bad stuff, heroin, right? He's okay now. You can trust him, you know? So there's so many more, but you know, it's just it's incredible. You know, it's the God of my experience, right? And that all came through submitting to the process of the 12 steps.
Such cool experiences. Thanks for being willing to share those, David. Well, I appreciate all your participation. David, I really thank you again. I hope that you and that others who were here live and those who will listen later got something of value and meaning out of this. I know I have. Now, if you, the listener, have found value in this meeting or any of the other 30 RICO 12 speaker meetings that we've done, please take a minute and go to the podcast platform of your preference and leave a rating and review. It's how we get this service out to more addicts who suffer, and a big part of how we work our 12th step, and a way you can work your 12th step too. We will be back again live on this coming Friday at noon Central Time with David H., a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, sober since 2005. He will be speaking to us on the integrated life, embracing the shadows, and making peace with our shame. I'm sure it'll be a good one. I'm excited about it. David, we're going to close out with a recovery prayer. Do you have any words of wisdom before we do that prayer?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to do the Thomas Merton prayer here to close us out. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear. You are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen. All right. Well, thank you. Keep coming back. It works when I work it, so work it. You are worth it. Thanks, David.